I didn't want to take the job, but I didn't have a choice. The landlord said the house had been abandoned for years, left to rot until someone like me came along to haul out the trash and make it livable again. The pay was good. Too good. It didn't take long to see why. The first time I walked up the driveway, I saw it. A pale face in the upstairs window watching me. I froze, my gut screaming at me to leave. But when I looked again, it was gone, and I told myself it was just a trick of the light. It wasn't. I stood at the foot of the driveway, staring up at the empty window, my pulse pounding in my ears. The face had been there. I was sure of it. Pale, hollow, and motionless, just watching me. But now the window was blank, reflecting the dull gray sky. "You're imagining things," I muttered, gripping the handle of my cleaning kit tighter. I couldn't afford to let nerves get the better of me. This job was too important, the money too good to walk away from. I forced myself forward, the gravel crunching under my boots as I approached the house. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel, pressing against my skin like the weight of unseen eyes. The front door was stiff, the hinges groaning as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house smelled of mildew and decay, a damp, rotting scent that clung to everything. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with old, peeling wallpaper and crooked picture frames. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each creak of the floorboards louder than the last. I glanced back at the door, already feeling uneasy. But there was nothing behind me, just the silent, empty yard beyond the threshold. "It's just a house," I said under my breath, as though the words would dispel the tightness in my chest. I set down my kit and started in the living room. Dust blanketed everything, the furniture, the floor, the windowsills. Most of the furniture was covered in white sheets, sagging and yellowed with age. As I moved, I pulled the sheets away, shaking out the dust and folding them into a pile. The room felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The shadows seemed too dark, the corners too deep. The light streaming through the broken blinds should have illuminated everything, but it didn't. Then I saw it again. The chair in the corner, the one I could have sworn was empty when I entered, had an impression in the seat, as though someone had just been sitting there. The dust on the fabric was disturbed, a faint outline of a body pressed into the cushion. I froze, staring at it. My first thought was that maybe I'd brushed against it, but I knew I hadn't been near the chair. The room was silent, but it felt charged, like the air just before a thunderstorm. A faint creak echoed from the ceiling above me, like a footstep. I looked up instinctively, my heart racing. The face, the upstairs window. The memory of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I told myself it was nothing, that old houses made noises. But when I looked back at the chair, the dust had settled and the impression was gone. I stood there staring at the chair, my heart hammering. The dust had settled, erasing any trace of the impression I'd just seen. It felt as though the room was daring me to question what I'd witnessed. My hands trembled as I clutched the rag I'd been using to clean, and I forced myself to focus. "Just keep moving," I muttered to myself, trying to shake the growing unease. I moved to the far corner of the living room, sweeping cobwebs off the walls and ceiling, pretending that nothing strange had happened. But every movement felt mechanical, like I was going through the motions while my senses screamed at me to leave. Then another sound, a faint tap, 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 came from upstairs. I froze mid-swipe, staring at the ceiling. The tapping was steady, deliberate, like someone was knocking on the floorboards above me. "Probably a loose shutter," I said aloud, my voice shaky and hollow. I didn't believe my own words. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each one louder than the last. When I reached the top, the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. At the end of the hallway was the room with the window, the one where I'd seen the face. Its door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of light spilled onto the dusty floorboards. I swallowed hard, stepping closer, my palms sweating as I pushed the door open. The room was empty, or at least it looked empty at first glance. The window was covered in grime, but I could still make out the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze outside. A thin layer of dust coated everything. An old dresser, a bed frame missing its mattress, and a broken mirror leaning against the wall. Then I saw the handprint. It was on the glass of the window, faint and smudged, but unmistakable. The fingers were long and thin, and the print looked fresh, as if someone had been standing there only moments ago. I backed out of the room, my breathing ragged. As I turned to go back downstairs, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty, just the long stretch of shadowy floor and peeling wallpaper. I bolted back downstairs, my footsteps echoing loudly as I hit the living room. I told myself to grab my cleaning kit and leave, but something held me there. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. The face, the handprint, the footsteps. There had to be an explanation. I spotted an old cabinet in the corner of the room, half hidden under a sheet. The doors were warped and stuck, but after a few tugs they creaked open, revealing stacks of yellowed papers and a collection of small trinkets. Among the clutter, I found an envelope marked with a single word: "Don't." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were several photographs, all black and white, their edges curled with age. The first was of the house, pristine and beautiful, taken decades ago. The second showed a family standing in front of it, a man, a woman, and a little boy. The third photo made my stomach drop. It was the same room I was standing in, but the chair in the corner wasn't empty. A man sat there, his face pale and hollow, with blackened eyes and a twisted grin. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the photo. The man in the chair looked exactly like the face I'd seen in the window. The tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from upstairs anymore. It was coming from the basement. I clutched the photos tightly, my heart pounding as I moved toward the basement door. It was cracked open, revealing nothing but darkness below. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic and insistent, like it was beckoning me to come closer. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. The tapping stopped. And then, from the darkness, I heard a faint, rasping voice. "Why are you here?" The voice sent ice down my spine, its rasping tone barely more than a whisper, but loud enough to root me to the spot. I gripped the photographs tightly, my knuckles whitening as I stared into the open basement door. The darkness felt alive, shifting subtly as if waiting for me to step inside. "I'm just here to clean," I stammered, my voice breaking. "I'm not trying to bother you." The silence that followed was worse than the voice. The tapping started again, this time louder, faster, and coming from deeper within the basement. My body screamed at me to leave, but I found myself stepping toward the door, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, the dim light from the living room fading with each step. At the bottom, the tapping stopped. The basement was empty, just a vast open space cluttered with old furniture and forgotten junk. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood the chair. It was the same chair from the living room, the same one from the photograph. But it shouldn't have been there. Dust swirled around it, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure sitting in it. A man, pale and grinning. I blinked, and the chair was empty again. "Why are you here?" The voice rasped again, this time right behind me. I spun around, the photograph slipping from my hand and scattering across the floor. The shadows in the room shifted, coalescing into a figure. It was the man from the photograph. Blackened eyes, a twisted grin, and a presence that felt impossibly heavy. He didn't move, but I could feel him watching, his grin widening as the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came in sharp gasps, visible in the freezing air. "I just want to leave," I whispered, backing toward the stairs. The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "You can't," he said, his voice a guttural echo. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into total darkness. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet pounded against the basement stairs, the creaking wood groaning under my weight. Behind me, I heard the sound of something following. Slow, deliberate footsteps, each one heavier than the last. As I reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I grabbed the doorknob, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the house. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. The growling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The door flew open suddenly, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my cleaning kit, threw open the front door, and bolted outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back as I raced to my car, fumbling with the keys and throwing myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the driveway, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. As I reached the end of the street, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and dark, but in the upstairs window, the pale face was back, watching me with its hollow eyes and twisted grin. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The face, the voice, the tapping, it stayed with me, haunting my thoughts long after I left the house behind. That night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard it again. Faint tapping, coming from the walls of my apartment. I was wandering through the flea market when I saw it. Among the jumble of old trinkets and forgotten keepsakes, a small music box caught my eye. Its faded floral carvings looked strangely familiar, though I couldn't place why. Something about it tugged at me, made my chest tighten. My hand hovered over the box and an icy shiver ran through me. I couldn't help myself. I picked it up and turned the tiny key. When the lid opened, a melody spilled out and my breath hitched. I knew this tune. I'd heard it before, in the darkest corners of my nightmares. My heart started to race. I should have put it back, walked away, done anything but keep holding it. Yet, I couldn't let it go. Before I realized what I was doing, I handed the vendor some crumpled bills and took it home, the haunting melody still looping in my mind, each note as sharp and unsettling as a scream in the night. By the time I got home, I wasn't sure why I'd bought it. It felt wrong, like a mistake I couldn't take back. But I couldn't bring myself to toss it aside either. I set the box down on the coffee table and stared at it, the faint floral carvings almost glowing in the dim light of my apartment. It was ridiculous. Just an old trinket, I told myself. But the air around it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I gave a small, nervous laugh and shook my head, trying to snap out of it. But the memory of that melody still lingered. Out of habit, I grabbed my laptop and plopped onto the couch. Maybe I could look up the history of the music box, figure out why it felt so familiar. But before I could start searching, a sudden chill crept through the room. It made me pause, and I realized my apartment was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you, making every little sound feel deafening. Then I heard it. The faintest strain of the melody, so soft it could have been my imagination. My eyes darted to the music box. I hadn't touched it since I got home, and yet it felt like it was alive. Swallowing hard, I told myself it was just nerves, just my overactive mind playing tricks on me. I ignored the sinking feeling in my stomach and forced myself to go about my evening. That night, the nightmares came back. They always started the same way, shadowy figures twisting and moving just beyond the edge of sight, their shapes undefined but their presence suffocating. And the melody, the same haunting melody, playing like a broken record, echoing in the darkness. This time, though, something was different. One of the shadows turned, its hollow face fixed on me. "You let it in," it whispered, its voice low and guttural. I woke up gasping, my heart racing. The air felt colder than it should, and I could swear I heard a faint, familiar tune still hanging in the air. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the sheets like they could somehow protect me. The whisper still rang in my head. You let it in. My eyes darted to the doorway, to the closet, to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Nothing moved, but the air was thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was watching me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet brushing the cold floor. My body trembled as I forced myself to move, every nerve screaming at me to run. I tiptoed into the living room, drawn to the coffee table where I'd left the music box. It was still there, sitting innocently in the dim light. My breath caught when I noticed the lid was open. I was sure I had closed it. The tiny key lay beside it, perfectly still. The melody wasn't playing anymore, but I could hear it echoing faintly in my mind, as if it had burrowed into my skull. I didn't dare touch the box again. Instead, I crouched down to examine it, hoping I'd find some kind of explanation. That's when I noticed the scratches. Faint, almost invisible against the aged wood. AG. The initials jolted something deep inside me, like I'd heard them before but couldn't remember where. I felt a sudden, desperate need to know more. Leaving the music box untouched, I grabbed my laptop and started searching. I typed Music Box AG initials into the search bar, my fingers trembling over the keys. It took hours, scrolling through useless results, dead ends, and antique forums filled with speculation. But finally, I found something. An article, old and barely readable, about a girl named Amelia Gray. She'd gone missing in 1953, and the only thing recovered was a music box. This music box. I felt a knot tighten in my chest as I read on. The writer mentioned that the music box had passed through several hands over the decades, leaving a trail of tragedy in its wake. People spoke of nightmares, mysterious deaths, and whispers in the night. One line stood out to me, chilling me to the bone. Those who possess it always claim they've heard the melody before. A sudden creak behind me made me jump. My head snapped around, my eyes darting to the shadows of the living room. Nothing was there, at least not that I could see, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The air was colder now, so cold my breath fogged as I exhaled. I reached for the music box, unsure if I was trying to protect it or myself, when the melody began to play again. The box wasn't wound. I stumbled back, heart racing as the tune filled the air, louder this time, more distorted. My eyes darted toward the shadows pooling near the far wall. They were moving. Slowly, deliberately, as if something was stepping out of them. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure, its shape wrong and shifting, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It tilted its head toward me, just as it had in my nightmare. And in that same guttural, scraping voice, it whispered, "You let it in." The room felt like it was folding in on me. The shadowy figure loomed larger, its outline twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a draft. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out the warped melody spilling from the music box. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the floor. The figure took a step forward, if you could call it that. Its movement wasn't natural. It slithered, sliding through the shadows like it was a part of them. I stumbled backward, my knees nearly giving out. My hand found the edge of the coffee table and I gripped it like a lifeline, my eyes never leaving the figure. "What do you want?" My voice cracked as I shouted the words. The figure didn't respond, but I felt it, inside my head. It wasn't speaking in words, but its presence was a suffocating weight pressing against my thoughts, unraveling them. The melody grew louder, sharp, and dissonant, as if the music box was screaming. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the room. It was inside me. It was clawing through my skull, dragging memories to the surface that I had buried long ago. I saw flashes of my childhood, vivid and raw. I was standing in a darkened hallway, my tiny hands clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit, My parents' voices echoed in the background, arguing, shouting. The melody played faintly then too, though I couldn't remember why or how. The shadowy figure seemed to sense this memory, its form shifting to something smaller, more human-like. My voice wavered as I shouted again, "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its shape flickering like a dying flame. Then, for the first time, it spoke in words that weren't whispered. "Remember." The word hit me like a physical blow. The shadows swirled, pulling me deeper into the memory. My childhood home materialized around me, the walls warped and decayed, as if they'd been rotting for years. The melody grew softer, almost soothing, as the figure loomed in the background, watching me. I remembered the music box now. I'd seen it before. It had belonged to my grandmother, a strange, reclusive woman with a fascination for the macabre. She'd given it to me once, years ago, when I was too young to understand its weight. "It's yours now," she'd said, her voice trembling. "But be careful. It doesn't forget." I didn't know what she'd meant at the time, but the words burned in my mind now. The figure was drawing closer, its presence pulling me back to the present. The music box was still playing, though its notes were fractured, distorted, as if it were breaking apart. I could feel the shadows closing in, pressing against my skin. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed the music box and flung it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, and for a moment, the melody stopped. The figure paused, its head snapping toward the broken box. Its form wavered like it was caught in a gust of wind. I ran. My feet barely touched the floor as I bolted for the door. But before I could reach it, the melody started again, louder than before. The box wasn't just playing, it was screaming. The sound reverberated through the apartment, shaking the walls and shattering the light bulbs overhead. The figure appeared in front of me, blocking my path. Its face, if it had one, was inches from mine. "You cannot escape," it said, the words rattling through me like thunder. "You invited me in." My mind raced as I tried to process its words. "I didn't invite you," I screamed, my voice hoarse. "I didn't know." The figure didn't respond, but its presence grew heavier, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. The melody twisted, turning into a cacophony of overlapping notes, each one dragging me further into despair. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness. But then I remembered something. My grandmother's warning. "It doesn't forget." She'd known. She'd always known. The box wasn't just an object, it was a vessel, a doorway. And I had opened it. I forced myself to focus, to push past the terror. The figure fed on fear. I could feel it, sense it. The more afraid I was, the stronger it became. My hands fumbled for something, anything, to fight back. My fingers brushed against the broken shards of the music box on the floor. They were sharp, splintered, but they were all I had. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though my voice shook with the effort of the lie. The figure froze, its form flickering as if my words had thrown it off balance. I gripped one of the shards and lunged, stabbing it into the heart of the figure's shadowy chest. The room exploded with sound, the melody screaming louder than ever before. The figure writhed, its form disintegrating into smoke and light. For a moment, I thought I'd won. Then the music box started playing again. The sound was faint now, but it was there. I looked down and saw the shard of the music box glowing faintly in my hand. The melody wasn't coming from the box anymore. It was coming from me. I collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down my face. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a stain on my soul. The music box lay in pieces around me, the warped engravings glinting in the dim light. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the fragments. Eventually, the melody faded into silence. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. In the weeks that followed, the nightmares stopped. The melody didn't haunt me anymore, not in the way it had before. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd catch myself humming it without realizing. It was like it had become a part of me, a scar that would never truly heal. I moved out of the apartment not long after. I wanted to leave everything behind, the music box, the memories, the terror. But on my last day, as I packed up the last of my belongings, I heard it. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. A child's voice humming the melody from the hallway. I froze, my heart sinking. Slowly, I stepped outside and saw a little girl playing with something small and wooden in her hands. She looked up at me and smiled. The music box wasn't gone. It had simply found someone new. What would you do if a childhood nightmare came to life? Share your thoughts on Emily's terrifying encounter with the cursed music box in the comments below. Jake was the perfect roommate, or so I thought. He kept to himself, paid his rent on time, and never made a mess. We barely talked, but that was fine with me. Then one night, everything changed. I came home to find his bedroom door open. That alone was strange, since Jake always kept it locked. My curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. What I found shouldn't have been possible. The room was empty, completely empty. No bed, no clothes, not even a stray sock. It was as if no one had ever lived there. My stomach churned as I replayed the mundane texts Jake had sent me earlier that day. He'd joked about cleaning schedules, even asked if I wanted anything from the grocery store. But now I was left wondering, who the hell was Jake? I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the bare walls of Jake's room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The room was spotless. No furniture, no clothes, not even dust in the corners. It was as if no one had ever lived there. But I knew Jake had been here. He'd just texted me earlier about picking up milk. I had seen him walk through that door countless times. My stomach churned as I stepped inside, half expecting Jake to jump out and tell me this was some kind of elaborate prank. But the silence was heavy, oppressive, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. I ran my fingers along the walls, half hoping I'd find some hidden compartment or explanation for what was happening. Nothing. Just cold, bare drywall. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my messages with Jake. They were all there. Reminders about rent, questions about cleaning schedules, even jokes about my taste in music. They were so normal. Too normal. "Hey, Jake," I typed, my fingers trembling. "Are you home?" The message sent, and I stared at the screen, waiting for the 3 little dots that would tell me he was typing. They appeared almost instantly. "Not yet. Why? Everything okay?" I stared at the response, bile rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I didn't know where to start. Instead, I typed back, "Yeah, just wanted to check." I put my phone down and sank onto the couch, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Jake had been moving out and didn't tell me. Maybe he had another place and kept this room for emergencies. It didn't make sense, but it was better than the alternative. That I'd been living with someone, or something, that wasn't supposed to exist. The creak of a floorboard snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked up, heart hammering. The hallway was dark, but I could swear I saw a shadow move just beyond the edge of the light. "Jake?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I got up slowly, inching toward the hallway. The air felt heavier the closer I got, each step harder than the last. When I reached Jake's door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it again, but something deep inside me needed to know. Suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The force of the door slamming echoed through the apartment, leaving the air heavy with silence. My hands were shaking, and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. "Jake!" I called again, louder this time. The silence stretched on, unbroken. I stepped back into the living room, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out of there. But where would I go? And what would I even say? Hey, I think my roommate doesn't exist? No one would believe me. My phone buzzed on the coffee table and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I snatched it up, relief washing over me when I saw Jake's name. He'd sent a new text. On my way home. Want me to grab anything? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. It didn't make sense. I had just been at his room. There was nothing there. No way someone lived in that space. My thumb hovered over the call button. I needed to hear his voice, needed to confirm he was real. I pressed call, and the phone rang once before going dead. No voicemail, no busy signal, just silence. I dropped the phone onto the couch, backing away like it might bite me. The hallway light flickered, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway where Jake's door had slammed shut. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door to Jake's room creaked open, just a sliver. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The door opened wider, and a figure stepped out. It was Jake, or at least it looked like him. Same clothes, same messy hair. But his movements were wrong. Too smooth, too mechanical, like he was imitating a human instead of being one. "Jake?" I whispered. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if he were studying me. Then he smiled, a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the same voice I'd heard before, but now it sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, knocking into the coffee table. "What the hell are you?" I shouted. His smile didn't falter. "I live here," he said, his tone casual, like we were discussing the weather. "With you." "No, you don't," I said, my voice rising. "I saw your room, it's empty, you're not real." Jake took a step closer, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, tilting his head again. His smile widened, stretching too far until it looked more like a grimace. I backed into the wall, my heart racing. "Stay away from me," I warned. Jake stopped, his head tilting further, his smile finally fading. "You let me in," he said, his voice a whisper now. "Don't you remember?" The room spun, the walls seeming to close in around me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he meant. Let him in? When? How? Before I could say anything, the lights flickered again, and Jake's form began to blur like he was dissolving into the shadows. And then he was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where Jake, or whatever that thing was, had disappeared. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence in the apartment was deafening, pressing against my ears. The words echoed in my mind. "You let me in. Don't you remember?" I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the couch to steady myself. My head swirled with questions I couldn't answer. Let him in? Was he talking about when I'd first moved in? I tried to think back, but my memories of meeting Jake were fuzzy, too fuzzy. I couldn't even remember the exact conversation we'd had about splitting the apartment. Just vague impressions, like the remnants of a dream I couldn't quite recall. The air in the apartment shifted, growing colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and goosebumps prickled my skin. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, a heavy, oppressive presence filling the room. My phone buzzed again, the sound startling me. I fumbled for it, my hands trembling, and looked at the screen. Another text from Jake. "I'm home." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. My stomach churned as dread settled deep in my bones. The shadows in the hallway began to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive. I clutched the phone tightly and slowly backed toward the front door, my eyes locked on the hallway. A low, rumbling noise began to build like distant thunder, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. "Jake?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadows stopped moving, and for a moment the room felt eerily still. Then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't leave. This is your home now." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I bolted for the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, and I yanked it open, stumbling out into the hallway. The cold followed me, seeping into my skin. As I turned to slam the door shut behind me, I saw the shadows surging forward like a tidal wave, their edges sharp and jagged, reaching for me. I slammed the door and ran down the hallway, my bare feet pounding against the floor. My phone buzzed in my hand again, but I didn't dare look at it. I could hear the shadows behind me, the sound like nails scraping against concrete. I burst through the front doors of the building and into the street, gasping for air. But the moment I stopped, I realized the cold had followed me. The shadows stretched out from the building, snaking toward me across the pavement. I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. I grabbed it and opened the screen, desperate for help, only to find a new message from Jake. "You can't run. You're part of this now." I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto a park bench several blocks away. The shadows didn't follow me this time, but the cold lingered, wrapping around me like an invisible shroud. My phone buzzed again, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I was too afraid of what I might see. Sitting there in the darkness, I tried to piece together what had happened. Jake wasn't real, at least not in the way I thought. He was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And somehow, I had let him into my life. But how? When? And then it hit me. I thought back to the day I'd moved in. Jake had texted me first, offering the room after I'd posted on a housing board. I'd never actually met him in person before agreeing. I hadn't asked any questions, hadn't thought twice about how perfect the arrangement seemed. I'd been so desperate for a place to stay that I'd ignored every red flag. "You let me in." His words replayed in my mind, sending a shiver down my spine. I'd invited him, whatever he was, into my life without realizing it. And now, he was part of me. The realization left me cold. If Jake was right, I couldn't run. Not forever. He would always find me. I stood up, my legs shaking, and started walking. My phone buzzed again, and this time I forced myself to look. The message was short, chilling in its simplicity. "See you soon." I threw the phone into a trash can and kept walking, but I knew it wouldn't help. The cold was still there, following me, waiting. Jake, or whatever he was, wasn't gone. He was waiting for the moment I let my guard down, waiting to reclaim what I had given him. Months later, I saw a new housing ad online. The room looked familiar, and the ad was posted by someone named Jake. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The details were vague, but one line sent a shiver through me. "Looking for a quiet roommate to share a cozy space." I closed my laptop and turned away, but I knew it wasn't over. Not for me. And not for whoever clicked on that ad next. Think twice before trusting your next roommate. Jake might be waiting for you. Share this story with someone who loves a good scare.